Okay, this is a screencast to basically keep us on track for herpetology because I had pink eye on Monday and couldn't be in class because I didn't want anybody to be getting anything from me. So anyway, I'm going to take you partway through the reproduction life history section on amphibians, and then we'll pick up where this screencast left off on Wednesday. So when we think about life histories have everything to do with, or life history theory has everything to do with patterns of reproduction and lifespan in organisms. So how long do you live? When during your life do you reach sexual maturity? When do you breed for the first time? How often do you breed? How many offspring do you have when you breed, et cetera, et cetera. And so it has to do with reproduction, growth, lifespan is essentially what the general area of life histories has to do with. And so we can think about this in organisms out there in nature as well as humans, in that we have reproductive cycles. And in the case of amphibians and reptiles, these reproductive cycles are oftentimes triggered by environmental stimuli. And these environmental stimuli basically affect our nervous system, our brain, and in the hypothalamus, we basically produce a series of hormones, and in this case, releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which then stimulates the pituitary, and then the pituitary produces gonadotropins, either follicle-stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone or those kinds of things. Those hormones then affect gonads, which then leads to the production of testosterone and estrogens, and these things then can feed back on gonadal development. The gonads ultimately are basically producing the gametes, and these gametes are then used for reproduction. These hormones that are produced by the gonads also are responsible for essentially governing the development of secondary sexual characteristics. These secondary sexual characteristics in and of themselves can influence reproductive behaviors, but also the brain influences reproductive behaviors, and once again, that's going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. And so there are various feedbacks. Things happening in the gonads can feed back on the brain and the pituitary in ways that govern their release of hormones. And so reproductive cycles are governed by a variety of different organs, usually having to do with the nervous system and the gonads. And these basically are cyclic in many cases in amphibians and reptiles, but they're always going to be cued by environmental factors. And sometimes this will be things like temperature, and other times it will be due to a combination of temperature and the occurrence of rainfall. But there are always going to be these environmental triggers. So when we think about modes of fertilization in amphibians, we've talked about how some amphibians have internal fertilization. The salamanders and the caecilians both exhibit internal fertilization, although they go about it in very different ways. This is the situation in salamanders, where male salamanders will put down a spermatophore, and the spermatophore usually has a base, which is kind of a mucousy base, usually made up of some sort of glycoprotein. And then there will be a cap, and this cap is basically where the sperm are stored in the spermatophore. And what will happen is a female will come and she will place her cloaca over the spermatophore. In some cases she does this on her own. In other cases she's guided to the spermatophore by the male, and she will basically plop her cloaca down on top of the spermatophore, open up the cloacal opening, and suck the spermatophore in. And the sperm on top of the spermatophore will basically be stored in a place called the spermatheca. Spermatheca is for sperm storage. And unfortunately, your book doesn't have any drawings of the spermatheca, but here in section C, you can see that this is the opening of the cloaca and then the cloacal tube here. And then most spermathecae are dorsal evaginations of the cloacal region, and they're oftentimes complexly coiled, and they basically serve, you can see in this micrograph up here, they basically serve as receptacles for sperm storage, and you can see that this one is full of sperm. And so this is the case in plethodonid salamanders, which is what this is, but this is very similar in lots of salamanders. Salamanders can store lots of sperm in these areas, and they can store sperm from multiple males in these areas. And so one of the things about internal fertilization is it allows to give the female a little bit of control over whose sperm basically is actually used to do the fertilizing of the eggs. In external fertilization, though, you have a male clasping a female in this situation. And in this case, what's going to be happening is this male's sperm are being spread across this female's eggs as the eggs leave the female. And so there is no opportunity for another male to, in this particular case, to be fertilizing those eggs. And so one of the things about external fertilization in neurons is that for this male, he has relatively high assurance of paternity, assuming that he can fight off other males during the process of courtship. You will notice in this past slide that this male has amplexed with the female. You can't even actually see the female, except that you can see her legs extending out, but the female is totally blocked in this photo because of amplexus. So amplexus is simply the fancy pants word for when males grasp the females, and they can do a variety of different kinds of amplexus. Here is a Mexican burrowing toad, and we see that the Mexican burrowing toads have amplexus, which is inguinal. They basically grasp around in front of the hind legs, leaving most of the body of the male hanging off the back end here. In probably the majority of amphibians, we have what's called axillary amplexus, which is in B here, where the male has grasped the female behind the front legs, and this positions the male in a way that as the eggs exit the female, the male's cloaca is right there to provide sperm. And then we also have cephalic amplexus, where the male grasps the female's head. And depending on the size of the male, in some cases, that positions him well at the back end of the female. But in some cases, if it's a small male relative to the size of the female, the male will eject his sperm and they will basically dribble down the back, usually in a channel that is created by the back of the female, that then directs sperm onto the eggs as they're being laid. One of the things about amplexus types is usually these amplexus types are relatively well conserved, and so a particular group of frogs will display a particular type of amplexus, and then another family of frogs might exhibit a different kind of amplexus. And so amplexus type has actually been used in behavioral phylogenies that use behavioral data as part of the data set to infer evolutionary relationships. Internal fertilization in neurons is relatively uncommon compared to external fertilization, but it does occur, and it occurs in a diverse group of organisms. In figure A here, we have the tailed frog from the northwestern United States. You can see that there is an outgrowth of the cloaca that basically forms an intromittent organ, and that's how internal fertilization is achieved by tailed frogs. This is a case with Lutherodactylus johnstoni from Puerto Rico, and in this particular case, the female actually grasps the male in amplexus. So you can see here, the female's legs are coming up around the male, pulling the male down so that his cloaca comes up and makes contact with her cloaca. And at that point, once that connection is made, the male can transfer sperm to the female. And so there are a variety of ways in which internal fertilization can occur in neurons, although once again, this is the exception rather than the rule for neurons. And then, once again, your book talks briefly about this, but it doesn't give you any visuals. But internal fertilization in caecilians is accomplished by the presence of the phalloidium. And so here's a caecilian preserved in a jar. And remember that caecilians have very short stubby tails. And so right here at the base of the tail is once again an outgrowth or an eversion of a pocket that is up inside of the cloaca. And once again, just in some ways similar to a hemipenis, they have particular shapes that are oftentimes distinctive to a particular species. And this then is the male intromittent organ that allows the male to internally fertilize female caecilians. So that's the phalloidium. And that's spelled down in the notes if you look at this in presenter review. So when we think about egg laying, there are a variety of different mechanisms by which amphibians go about the process of laying eggs. In the case of most plethodonid salamanders, although not all plethodonid salamanders, but many plethodonid salamanders, you can tell that this is a plethodonid because of the presence of the nasolabial groove and the projection of the lip right there. This plethodonid is laying her eggs on land. They will be direct developing and they will emerge as little miniature salamanders. On the other hand, Ambystoma opacum, the marbled salamander from the southeastern United States, tends to lay its eggs in depressions under logs on the surface of the soil. And then the female will sit there and sit on top of the eggs and guard the eggs until rains in the late fall or early spring come in and fill up those shallow depressions. At that point, those eggs will hatch, little larvae will hatch, and there is an aquatic, free-living larval stage. So remember with amphibians that one of the things you have to separate in amphibian development is whether or not you have a free-living aquatic larval stage or do you undergo direct development such that you do all of your embryonic development inside of the egg and then emerge as little miniatures of the adult without going through that free-living larval stage. And in this case, we have two species in this case, which both lay their eggs on land, but one of them is direct developing, the plethodonid salamander, and the marbled salamander has a free-living larval stage. Where anurans are concerned, oftentimes you will see these large, bulky, rounded egg masses that are typical of ranid frogs, pond breeding frogs. Here's a close-up where you can see the individual eggs. Oftentimes the eggs are differently colored depending on what side of the egg is facing you. You see some of them look white, but it's because the dark side is facing away from you. Some frogs build foam nests. Here you can see two frogs building a foam nest. This is a foam nest that is going to contain the eggs and floats on top of the water, but you can also have foam nests that are that are created in vegetation overhanging water, and as the eggs develop, the structure of the foam nest slowly breaks down over time, and when the eggs hatch, the larvae will sink to the bottom of the foam nest and basically drip out of the foam nest and fall into the water below. You can have individuals who will lay eggs down in retreats and burrows. Here's a form of a sort of gelatinous hanging nest of frogs, and you can see the developing tadpoles inside there. You will have individuals that once again lay their eggs on land, and in many of these cases either the male or the female, depending on the group, will do mate guarding duties. And so here you have a direct developing frog with some froglets about ready to hatch and some newly hatched froglets. And so you have terrestrial eggs being laid. And the problem with terrestrial eggs is that they have the potential to undergo quite a lot of predation by terrestrial predators. Cat-eyed snakes in particular are well known for feeding on terrestrial egg nests. Once again, a foam nesting frog here in in panel A, and so here you have a foam nest that is then going to be guarded by a female, and this is the female continuing to guard the nest even after the nest has hatched. And evidently these little squirmy things all around her are newly hatched tadpoles. And so parental care is very important in some groups because once again you want to be doing as many things as you can to assure the success of whatever offspring you produce. And one way of doing that, humans do and frogs do, is parental care. One form is just guarding a foam nest like this. Another case is a situation that happens in dendrobatid frogs, which is a situation where, depending on the species, once again, the male or the female will actually have the tadpoles crawl up and adhere to the back of the parent frog, and the parent frog will hop around the forest with these tadpoles attached. He or she will occasionally go to water. The tadpoles will slide off of the back, go into the water, rehydrate themselves, feed a little bit, and then will climb back onto the back of the parent frog and then go through the forest. I've seen this for myself in Peru with tadpoles adhering to the back of the frogs. There are interesting things in terms of how frogs brood their eggs, and so in many cases they just lay their eggs into a body of water and let them go, and there's no parental care involved. In some cases they carry them around like this. In other cases, there will be pouches on the back of the female that allow the eggs to be placed inside of the pouch, and she will carry them around with her. In other cases, in the cases of pipids, the dorsal skin will grow up around the eggs, and so in each of these little holes, there is an egg embedded in each of those holes, and you can see this proliferation of tissue that has grown up to encase the eggs. This is an aquatic species, and oftentimes these aquatic species will live in fast-flowing streams and difficult to lay eggs in those environments, not have them just be washed away. And then this is Darwin's frog, Rhinoderma darwini, which is a frog that broods offspring in his vocal pouch. And so this is parental care being provided by a male in this case. And then panel A up here is an interesting frog in that this is Gastrotheca, which is a gastric brooding frog. Not a gastric brooding frog, a frog that once again develops in a dorsal pouch. For whatever reason, I don't have a photo of the gastric brooding frog, but there's another species, Rheobatrachus silus, which is called the gastric brooding frog, which does brood her eggs in the stomach. So lots of different places to brood offspring. Once again, the longer you associate yourself, the adult, with the offspring that you're producing, you're just maximizing the chances that those individuals will survive predation attempts. So I think what we'll do is stop there for now, and we'll talk about different larval types in class as we continue talking about reproduction in amphibians.